In this second part of the video, we're going to explore what the requirements are overall for the submission and the specific differences between a lead and a highly accomplished submission. At present, NESA is reviewing their policy and procedures documents around the higher level space, and so there may be some changes in the requirements. But at present, this is the landscape. As you can see, the central panel is documentary evidence and annotation. This is the core or the centre of the submission, and it requires a candidate to develop some material across all 37 standard descriptors, a minimum of once, and in many cases twice. The green box indicates that each candidate will have to have referee statements to support their claim at either the highly accomplished or the lead level. And we'll look a little bit more closely at what that involves for the 3 to 8 referees. The third pillar of the process is the observation, and you can see by the slide that there are 2 dimensions to this. There is an internal observation dimension, which happens in the school, where the principal observes a single lesson, a minimum of 1 lesson, and then either observes the second lesson themselves or delegates that responsibility to a senior member of staff. The other dimension of observation is the external observation or site visit, which is a 1-day visit conducted by NESA, and we'll have some more detail about that in a moment. With documentary evidence, the trick is to provide a chain of evidence that develops an understanding of what the need was, what you did, and what happened. So let's investigate that chain a little more closely. The first question you need to ask is what you did and why you did it. In the second question, how did the decision to do what you did impact on teacher practice? And finally, where is the evidence of improved student learning as a result of the actions that you took? Because teachers are very good at doing, this might be a result of the following actions. What did you do? You supported a colleague to develop a resource. How did it impact on that teacher's practice? Well, they used their resource in the classroom and adapted it and used it again. Shows that you've had an impact. Or does it? It simply shows that the teacher used the resource. And then finally, how would you find evidence of improved student learning? You might be able to say that the student's skills have improved. But I'm still not seeing any actual evidence of this impact. Where is the documentary evidence? So for this first step, perhaps it might be working notes from a meeting or a record of your feedback to the teacher, or the annotated resource which had been developed and evaluated. In the second step, how to evidence the impact on teacher practice, a copy of the adapted resource used by the teacher after they'd trialled your resource might be a useful piece of evidence. And then finally, to show that it actually made its way to the students, perhaps work samples before and after the teacher used the resource. So the documentary evidence in this case would be made up of those working notes, followed by an adapted copy of the resource, followed by some work samples, telling a great story of what the teacher did. So what does this evidence look like? It needs to be printed documents and not video or audio. Even though the AITSL site gives some indications of that, NESA will not allow any other digital formats. The evidence can be a single artefact, a program, an assessment task, a policy, or more likely and most effectively, a set of artefacts grouped into an evidence set. Each artefact or evidence set can provide evidence for a number of descriptors. Currently, somewhere between 10 and 35 artefacts or evidence sets are accepted in a submission. We find that for success, roughly between 13 and 18 seems to be a good number, but it will vary from candidate to candidate. These evidence sets address a theme or an area of practice. So it might be about assessment, it might be about improved literacy, it might be about student wellbeing, it might be about assisting teachers with differentiation. All of those things are possible. Each artefact is annotated, accompanied by a story written in narrative form, which tells the story in approximately 4,000 characters of what you did and why. So returning to those questions in the previous slide, your annotation will actually answer the top. What did you do and why? How did it impact on practice? And where was the evidence of student learning? Your evidence can be up to about 3 years old at the time you start the process and should be no more than 5 years old at the time of submission, and can be drawn from a range of schools or roles. So if you have recently changed roles but you have some evidence from your previous role, it is perfectly fine to use that, particularly if it is still being implemented in the school where you were. Each of the career stages, lead and highly accomplished, are required to have the same sort of documentary evidence. The only difference is that with lead, there is an extra component, the lead initiative. This is an initiative that you personally have developed and that you have embedded in the school, and it has run for a period of 6 months and continues to have an impact. The difference between a lead initiative and a normal evidence set with annotation is that the lead initiative is actually written about as a long annotation, and it doesn't have its own set of evidence attached to it. Rather, it is evidenced in various evidence sets and annotations, and it is discussed by at least one referee during the referee process. The second component of a submission for the higher levels is the provision of referee statements. NESA currently requires 3 minimum referees. They must be made up of your current principal, a senior or peer colleague, and a colleague who you are supporting. The maximum number of referees that you can currently have is 8. The way it works is you, as the teacher, reflect on your work and determine which standard descriptors might be appropriate for each of your referees. You provide your referee with the standard descriptor that you would like them to write on, but you cannot influence the writing that they do. You might remind them of an instance where they worked with you on something reflected in the descriptor, but it is the independent work of the referee. Each referee will also be required to write a relationship statement, which basically means how long have they worked with you and in what context. And they are also required to make a declaration that they are happy that you have met that standard descriptor. If they don't feel that they can, then they tick that you have not met that descriptor and their reference doesn't count. The third component is the observation, and as I have said, there are 2 parts to that. The school part is 2 lesson observations, one by the principal and one by a principal's delegate, or the principal themselves can also do the second one. The NESA external observation or site visit is a whole day visit. It's a planned day where you as the candidate identify the descriptors that you would like the external observer to observe. Roughly 7 to 10 descriptors are possible for observation in one day. During that day, you will plan 2 teaching sessions and you will identify which descriptors you are allocating to each session. And you will also plan at least one non-teaching session. During the day, the NESA observer also speaks to your principal. This is a very important part of the process because there are many of the standard descriptors, especially the ones around verbal and non-verbal communication, that are much more clearly observed by actually observing practice rather than by viewing paper evidence.